This is Fothentic History.
Hello, welcome to the show. I'm Brian Young.
And I'm Holly Fry.
Holly, do you like spaceships?
I sure do. How about you?
Yeah, of course I do. Of course I do. We're going to talk about a whole lot of them today, if that's cool with you.
That delights me utterly.
So we're going to talk about the history and designs of the different starfighters used by the Alliance to Restore the Republic, which was also called the Rebel Alliance. And since this episode's going to cover a lot of different ships over a couple of different eras, we're going to go through all of the alphabet soup of Rebel ships alphabetically by era.
That was a smart way to organize this outline. I have to give you props.
Oh, thank you.
Because I would be like, so many ships, I don't know. But we should point out that the Alliance to Restore the Republic actually started out as a variety of disparate rebel cells and squads that had little to no contact with one another, and they all dealt with spies and senators and others who were sympathetic for causes that directly opposed the Empire. And these cells scrambled for basically whatever starfighters they could get their hands on.
So we're going to start with the early days of resistance to the Empire. And in those first days, the only sorts of ships that rebels could get their hands on were leftovers from the Clone Wars. We'll talk about two types of ships that were repurposed from the Clone Wars in those early days, ARC 170s and Delta 7s. The Y-Wings are recovered Clone Wars ships. They didn't see heavy use in the Rebellion until much later, so we'll talk about them later as well.
And we're going to start, as Brian said, with the ARC 170, which was also known as the Aggressive Reconnaissance Fighter. And these were manufactured in a joint cooperation between Incom and Subpro, and they were the best starfighters in the field by the end of the Clone Wars. These hyperdrive-equipped ships were sleek enough for long-range missions, but they were also hardy enough for intense fighter-to-fighter combat.
These fighters were unique in that they had a crew of 3, 4 if you count an astromech droid. They had a pilot, a gunner, and a tail gunner. If that gives you an idea of how large these fighters actually were. They were very bulky, but nimble enough for ship-to-ship fights. They were almost 13 meters in length and had a wingspan of almost 20 meters. They were equipped with 4 laser cannons, 2 each for the fore and aft, as well as 2 proton torpedo launchers.
These ships saw use for about 5 years into the time of the Empire, until they were phased out and TIE fighters gradually replaced them. It was then that the Alliance to Restore the Republic, in its early days, acquired and retrofitted a number of them for use in mixed squadrons. Notable pilots that were forced to fly these aging craft at various times during the war include Thane Carell, Shara Bay, Braylon Strom, and Nora Wexley.
Not many of them were available, so they didn't see a whole lot of action widespread through engagements the Republic or the Rebellion had, but they did help the Alliance in its early days, and that's largely the same case with the Aethersprite Delta 7s.
Delta 7 Aethersprite-class light interceptors were small, triangular starfighters made for a single pilot with an astromech droid that were more commonly referred to as Jedi starfighters. Delta 7s couldn't fly through hyperspace on their own. They required a hyperspace ring, which limited their capabilities for a Rebel alliance that needed to remain nimble. But they did see action for the Rebels in the early days, as there weren't exactly a bunch of Jedi around who needed the ships.
Yeah, these ships needed a lot of modification, though. One thing I was really interested to find as I was researching them is that they were designed by Kuat Systems in tandem with the Jedi, so that they were really hyper-responsive and actually were able to draw on the force abilities of the pilot and other force users so that they could actually reduce some of the systems that were in the ship, knowing that the pilot would be able to compensate for that. But force users were in short supply in the days of the Rebellion, so they had to sort of retrofit and pack and cram a whole bunch of stuff into them to make them flyable.
It's fairly obvious that the Rebels would get their hands on any ships they could, and at the close of the Clone Wars, as we said, Delta 7s and ARC 170s were pretty much the only surplus ships around that could accept pilots. Rebel cells across the galaxy got their hands on whatever they could, and they formed up in their own really roughly equipped squadrons. And there were plenty of more local ships that served as well. Ships like the Royal Naboo N1 Starfighter. We're not going to get quite into that level of granularity and detail, but we're going to instead stick with the major ships that were used across the largest swaths of the Alliance.
So, like I said, we're starting alphabetically, and that means we're starting with the A-Wing. But that's also a nice transition from the Delta 7s, as A-Wings can trace their lineage straight back to the Jedi Starfighter. A prototype known as an R-22 was developed as a replacement for the Delta 7, but was actually rejected by the Empire. And they had more flat noses and more resembled arrowheads than triangles than their predecessor.
The rebels got their hands on a few R-22s and adapted and replicated them into what they called RZ-1s, which were quickly nicknamed A-Wings. And these ships were some of the fastest that they ever put into the field, designed to keep up with the emerging variants of TIE fighters that were ever faster, including the TIE Interceptor.
Some of the first known uses of the A-Wings were the rebel cell overseen by Bail Organa in the year after Order 66. Phoenix Squadron also boasted a contingent of A-Wings in the days leading up to the Battle of Yavin. A-Wings had small two-crew trainer versions that saw use during this time as well. Ezra Bridger even took one of those on his sojourn to rescue other members of Phoenix Squadron from the Darkseid wielder Maul.
There were no A-Wings available at the Battle of Yavin, but when the broader rebellion coalesced together for the Battle of Endor and carried on through the Battle of Jakku, there certainly were. Under the command of General Lando Calrissian, a contingent of A-Wings designated as Green Squadron helped to bring down the second Death Star.
After the popularization of the RZ-1 and its use in saving the galaxy from the clutches of the Empire, Kuat actually designed a new RZ-2 that was in service for a time. Many aging RZ-2s found themselves in the Resistance fleet by the time of the conflict with the First Order, including the one that Tali Lintra was in when she was fired upon and presumed dead by Kylo Ren.
And now we're going to move on to B-Wings. And these ships, known to some as blockade busters, were actually designated as A/SF-01 B-Wing assault starfighters. And these heavy ships were split like a T with a revolving flight deck for a single pilot. The primary airfoil was almost 17 meters long, and they were loaded with equipment that you would probably expect only to see in a much larger craft. They boasted 3 ion cannons, a laser cannon, a twin auto blaster, 2 proton torpedo launchers, and laser-guided bombs.
Yeah, they're sounds like overkill when you put it that way.
They're like tanks. I mean, they're just...
So they were rugged and deadly in breaking blockades, but they were close to rubbish in starfighter to starfighter combat. They were big, lumbering, and unwieldy for the pilots, especially since the cockpit rotated to keep them upright and the ship moved around it. They needed really advanced pilots to fly them because that was like an added layer of difficulty. Though these ships were manufactured by the Verpine company Slane and Corpil, the first prototype was designed by the Mon Calamari master shipbuilder Corey.
And that first prototype, the B-6 Bladewing, was designed and perfected on the remote planet of Shantipole. Corey had been reluctant to give that design up, though, but he was convinced shortly before the Battle of Yavin when Hera Syndulla of Phoenix Squadron arrived on Shantipole and won him over with her skill as a pilot and her spirit as a fighter.
After Hera Syndulla used the Bladewing prototype to almost single-handedly take down an Imperial blockade, Bail Organa, who was the senator from Alderaan at this time and secretly financing or orchestrating as much of the rebellion as he could, he was impressed enough to seek a manufacturer for increased usage by the rebellion, and he found that partner with Slane and Corpil, who were sympathetic to the rebellion. Corey took the plans and largely redesigned the ship in tandem with Slane and Corpil, and they got it ready for use of the Rebel Alliance just in time for the Battle of Endor.
And part of that redesign included reducing the crew from 2 to just 1. The original prototype had a second cockpit for a gunner, but that was streamlined out of the design. And they also removed the focused fire system of the original prototype. The original was able to focus all of its lasers to one specific pinpoint, but that was too much for mass production.
The most notable squadron to participate in battles with B-Wings was probably called Blade Squadron. During the Battle of Endor, they were responsible for taking down Darth Vader's former flagship, the Devastator, and they went on to serve with distinction at the battles of Malastare, Kuat, and Jakku.
And these ships were unwieldy, but really effective. It turned out that Y-Wings, though much older, were more effective bombers and dogfighters than the B-Wings, but B-Wings were still effective as anti-capital ship fighters.
Yeah, no, and they're really just neat-looking ships. If I had to pick a design for one of them that's sort of my favorite, I think it would be the B-Wing.
Yeah, they look really cool.
So as we continue going through our list alphabetically, the next fighter that saw use by the Rebel Alliance was the Mandalorian Fang Fighter, or Protectorate Fighters as they were sometimes known. These ships were about 6 meters in length and had a nose with 2 forks that resembled fangs at the front. They were equipped with 2 wing-mounted laser cannons and a hidden proton torpedo launcher. Sorosub was the manufacturer behind them.
And these ships were built for single-pilot use, and they were in common use by the Mandalorian Protectorate. In fact, during the reign of the Empire, each member of the Mandalorian Protectorate who flew a Fang fighter was trained personally by Fen Rao, who was eventually killed by the rebel operative and Mandalorian Sabine Wren.
These fighters were largely a problem for the Alliance in the days before the Battle of Yavin. In fact, a squad of Fang fighters obliterated a squad of Rebel A-Wings during operations to secure the hyperspace route through the Concord Dawn system. But thanks to defections, the turning of Mandalorian loyalty, and other salvage operations, the Alliance to Restore the Republic was able to acquire some for various outposts and bases throughout the galaxy. They weren't widely used, but enough that they warranted note here.
And now we are moving on to U-Wings. Manufactured by Incom, the UT-60D U-Wing Starfighter support craft was both transport and gunship. And these were the last ships designed and made before the Empire took over operations of Incom. They had a very short production run, and so they were in very short supply, but that did not stop the Alliance from using them wherever they could.
U-Wings were very unique in their design. They had 2 strike foils, or more commonly known as S-foils, that could be in a forward position, giving them their U shape, or set backward. And the configuration of the wings wasn't just for looks, though, as the ships had different performance parameters depending on the wing deployment. Forward-facing closed the profile of the ship for combat situations, and let the shields protect the ship better. Rear-facing helped in flight situations.
U-Wings were big, almost 25 meters long when the wings were facing forward. Because of the size of their profile, they were choppy ships in atmosphere, and they were preferred for high altitude or space operations. They were equipped standard with a pair of laser cannons manufactured by Tame and Bake, and then the doors on either side of the ship could be used for infantry gunners with guns or cannons mounted inside the ship for their use.
U-Wings boasted 4 engines for sublight and in-atmosphere space travel as well as hyperdrives. Their flight deck could be operated by a single pilot but had room for 2 pilots, and it also had a maximum capacity for 8 infantry troops besides. There were smaller, less defensive civilian versions of the U-Wings with 2 engines instead of 4 available as well, and one of them did see use by the Rebels in their engagements on Lothal because the Lothal Rebels had acquired one.
The Rebel Alliance got a shipment of these for their use through subterfuge and careful planning on the part of Bail Organa. The Senator altered records in the Senate so that this lost shipment of U-Wings would be untraceable, and they found their way into the hands of the Alliance. When the Rebels were stationed at Yavin 4, codenamed Base 1, they were being vetted for wider use.
U-Wings played key parts in the battles of Lothal and Scarif, where ground-based forces were important, but with the battles of Yavin and Endor being largely space engagements, their use was limited. Most of the U-Wings in the fleet were assigned to Blue Squadron, which was largely destroyed at the engagement of Scarif, and at least one made it through the brunt of the war, though, ferrying troops to Naboo during Palpatine's Operation Cinder after the Battle of Endor.
And the next lettered ship we're going to talk about is the much beloved X-Wing. The T-65 X-Wings were the backbone of the Rebel Alliance fleet, and they became synonymous with the Rebel Alliance by the end of the war. Manufactured by Incom, X-Wings were designed to incorporate the best features of the ARC 170 fighter as well as the Z-95 headhunters that had seen use during the Clone Wars.
These ships were 12.5 meters in length and had split-wing S-foils that gave the ships their distinctive X shape when the foils were locked in attack position. They were equipped with fire-linked lasers at the end of every wing, as well as a proton torpedo launcher.
Since X-Wings boasted hyperdrives and shields, they had a distinct advantage over most Imperial TIE fighters. They were also highly maneuverable, giving them an edge in starfighter combat that other Alliance ships just did not have.
One reason the ships were so easy to use for the Rebel Alliance was the familiarity that many pilots had with the ship, and that was for two reasons. The first was that the T-16 Skyhopper, which was an incredibly popular civilian craft that Incom manufactured, had largely the same control scheme. So a pilot could jump from their T-16 pleasure craft to a T-65 X-Wing with very little problems and very little extra training. The second was that the Alliance leaked training and instruction manuals for the X-Wing into the galaxy on the dark parts of the holonet and whatnot, hoping that pilots willing to jump into the fight against the Empire would familiarize themselves with the X-Wing before joining, and many did.
X-Wings were in wide use among many squadrons and cells in the Rebel Alliance because they were easy to manufacture. Incom made a lot, but the Alliance also assembled their own versions in the T-65B. Green Squadron, which was part of Phoenix Squadron and led by Hera Syndulla, consisted of X-Wings, though it was mostly obliterated on Lothal a couple of years prior to the Battle of Yavin.
Blue Squadron, who we mentioned earlier, had U-Wings, but was largely an X-Wing squad. Led by General Antok Merrick, he and most of his pilots all lost their X-Wings and their lives at the Battle of Scarif. Red Squadron might be the most famous of the X-Wing squads, though. Red Squadron served at the Battle of Scarif and lived to tell the tale. Then they were key in launching the assault against the Death Star, with new recruit Luke Skywalker making the proton torpedo shot that destroyed the superweapon from the inside of an X-Wing.
Red Squadron also saw action under the leadership of Wedge Antilles at the Battle of Endor. In fact, we actually did an entire episode on the pilots of Red Squadron that you will want to check out to get into all of that history.
Yeah, it's definitely worth an episode of its own. So after the end of the war, Incom continued making X-Wings. Newer models included the T-70 and the T-85. Poe Dameron of the Resistance flew in a T-85 during his time in the New Republic Defense Fleet, but was downgraded to a T-70 when he joined the Resistance in the years just prior to the destruction of Hosnian Prime.
And now, the last ship that we're going to talk about is the BTL Y-Wing. Known more commonly as just the Y-Wing, it was a heavy bomber and starfighter manufactured by Consair Manufacturing. Y-Wings first saw service during the Clone Wars as a heavy ship for a pilot and a gunner. Shadow Squadron might have been the most noteworthy squad of Y-Wings during the Clone Wars, and Plo Koon, Anakin Skywalker, and Ahsoka Tano flew with them at one point.
Y-Wings had a snub-nosed pilot compartment at the front of the ship, and two large engines that jutted out at either side behind it, giving it its rough Y shape. They had built-in hyperdrives and they were heavily armored. They saw wide use during the course of the Clone Wars, both as military ships and for planetary defense forces. And it was these planetary defense forces that provided many of the Y-Wings to the Rebellion.
Many Y-Wings at this point had their gunner bubbles replaced with automated lasers that could be controlled by the pilot. And their primary use was as a bomber, but their versatility as a starfighter, albeit a lumbering one, was an advantage for the Alliance. The Alliance stripped them down to give them even more speed and maneuverability, which is what gave their engines sort of a skeletal appearance.
One of the most noteworthy acquisitions of Y-Wings happened when the Phoenix cell of the Rebellion went to Reclam Station in the Yarma system in an operation led by Ezra Bridger. A number of Clone Wars-era Y-Wings were scheduled to be decommissioned and destroyed, and in a reckless move, Ezra Bridger managed to get them into the hands of the Alliance and destroy Reclam Station all at the same time.
Though Phoenix Squadron took the ships, they ended up getting transferred to General Dodonna's rebel group at Yavin 4, and they were put to use as the backbone of Gold Squadron, who was perhaps the most the most noteworthy Y-Wing squadron in the Rebel fleet. Gold Squadron helped escort Mon Mothma to the protection of the Alliance and then fought with distinction at the battles of Scarif and Yavin. Only a single Y-Wing pilot from Gold Squadron made it out of the Battle of Yavin alive, and that was the Alderaanian Yvonne Verlaine.
Grey Squadron was the next Y-Wing group central to the Alliance, and they fought at Vrogus Voss in an attempt to kill Darth Vader. Y-Wings of Grey Squadron also took part in the battles of Mon Cala, the Mako Ta space docks, and other engagements leading up to the Battle of Endor. Reformed Grey and Gold Squadrons both fought in Endor.
Unlike X-Wings, Y-Wings found no love from the Resistance, and only a couple of old junk heaps of Y-Wings made it into service for them in the years after the end of the rebellion.
Yeah, I'd read some stories where pilots, they kind of felt like having to fly those Y-Wings. They only had, I think, 2 of them in the Resistance, and being forced to fly one was sort of like drawing the short straw. They were not happy about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for most pilots, when the options are like fast, nimble X-Wing versus clunky your Y-Wing, like it's obvious which way they're going to go.
And by the time the Resistance was fighting, the Clone Wars era ships were really old, like 60, 75 years. Easy. Yeah. But that's it for the Starfighters, the Rebellion. We could probably do a whole nother episode on other vehicles of the Rebellion, from capital cruisers and medical frigates all the way down to, T-47s. And we may well, but hopefully this gives you a good grounding in what ships the Rebellion used, how they came into the possession of the Alliance, and, what their fleet was like.
I love a little ship talk.
Yeah. So I don't have any mail, Holly, but I would love to get mail from listeners, and if they would like to email us at our website, if you go to fauthentichistory.com and use our contact form, you can send us an email, and we'd love to hear from your adventures, through the stories and your interactions with the stories that we've been telling on the show.
Yeah, that sounds grand.
Where can people find you, Holly?
Oh, I'm all over the internet. I'm on Twitter as Surliest Girl, and I'm on Instagram as SurlyGirly5. And you can find my history show Stuff You Missed in History class at missedinhistory.com. That's also how you find all of our social. And there's also a show called Full of Sith, which is all Star Wars all the time, that you and I do together.
Yeah, we do. So you can go to fullofsith.com and check us out there. And we're also going to be doing a live show of Authentic History at Star Wars Celebration.
That is correct. I'm very excited.
We've got a noted historian coming to join us.
We do indeed. A noted historian who is an expert on Naboo royal handmaidens, which to me is a fascinating topic. And there's been a lot of really interesting historical discovery in that arena.
Yeah, so if you're at Star Wars Celebration in Chicago and want to join us at Saturday?
Yeah.
Saturday at 1 p.m. on the podcast stage. We'll be there with noted historian E.L. Flonston.
Yes. I can't wait.
As far as finding me places, you can find me at Swankmatron on Twitter and everywhere else, and you can find my writing pretty much just going to my Twitter and finding it there. Let's just keep it at that. For Authentic History, you can go to fauthentichistory.com and you can listen to every back episode of the show we've done. There's a lot of history we've delved into, and we'll be diving into more sooner rather than later. And we'd love to have you review the show wherever you listen to it. So, unless there's anything else, Holly.
Not that I can think of.
Well, we'll catch you next time then.